Okay, looking at the different sections of the brain, and then we'll even look at the different lobes of the brain even. So right now we're just looking at the cerebrum, so that's the largest portion of the brain with its gyri, so its big old bumps and its sulci. The reason for those, just like your intestines again, we're increasing surface area. So we can go way down inside there and we can squeeze all this together. The very outer portion of the cerebrum is gray matter, so we talked about that in the previous lectures, where there's a bunch of cell bodies found there. So we like to have those, and that's where most of your processes is going on, your high thinking levels. So we need lots of surface area for those to squeeze in. Your diencephalon is just an area, so that's going to include your thymus and hypothalamus together, and we'll look at those in just a minute. Then we get into what is called our brain stem. So the green, yellow, and red or pink looking color, that would be our brain stem. Very, very important. Starting on the midbrain, and all of these actually are relaying information, whether it needs to go to the higher level of the cortex or not. It decides on relaying those sensory information up there, and the motor coming down, or it decides which one needs to go up there or not. So that's the midbrain. It kind of interprets things, whether it needs to go here to this side or that side. Does it need to go to the left side of the frontal lobe, or does it need to go to the right side? Midbrain does that. So it's a relay station. Whereas the pons, it helps with some heart rate and some respiratory things. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the main one is your medulla oblongata. Now that's where your cardiac center is, so that's your heart rate, how fast it's going to beat, how often it's going to beat, and then the pons will kind of fine-tune that rhythm, give you that normal sinus rhythm. It also has your respiratory center here, so this is what initiates breathing, tells you to breathe, how fast to breathe. Now, how deep and how rhythmic will come from the pons. But the main one is your medulla oblongata. So when you have what's called a brain stem injury in any of these areas, mainly this guy, if you have one here, an injury there, there's not a lot we can do for you. Because we can't make your heart beat for you. We can pace it, but it's got to be able to receive that information. So that's what they will say if you're when they diagnose you as brain dead. So you may have some information going to this brain stem, so your heart's still beating and you're still breathing, but nothing's going up above. When they do an EEG, an electroencephalogram, they detect to see if there's any electrical impulses coming up here to that higher level thinking, that cerebrum. And if there's not, then they would diagnose you as brain dead. So they still have to have you kind of alive to go in and, say, harvest heart and lungs. Kidneys, you can die and then go and get them. That's not as big of a deal. But the heart and lungs, they've got to be moving and beating, right then. They'll take them to the OR. They'll have the recipient in there as well, and they'll remove organs and put in. We talked about these membranes when we looked at the spinal cord, so we'll look at them again here, talking about the brain. So, encased in all of it, we have a skull that encases everything, but then we have membranes that are lying within there. The dura mater, just like on the spinal cord, is the very outermost, really strong connective tissue. And then we have the arachnoid mater. So we talked about how it sounds like spider, so arachnoid, and it is web-shaped. You can kind of see, and you can see this in your book. On this illustration, you can't see it as well, but they kind of make it look webbed inside here. And that's that subarachnoid space where you're going to find cerebral spinal fluid. Slapped right on top of the brain, as you can see here, we have the pia mater. And that's where we're going to have nestled in that pia mater our blood vessels. So to bring blood to and from the brain, we've got to have that meninge, that pia mater. So these are your meninges. There are 3 of them. Duramater, which is very durable, the outer. Then we have arachnoid mater, so it's the webbing where we find cerebral spinal fluid. And then the pia mater with its blood vessels sitting right on top of the brain itself. Same thing with the spinal cord. You have what are called dural spaces. And so these or sinuses, I'm sorry. These are just where blood has been removed from the brain and it's sitting there pooling, and it's going to be eventually moved back to the heart. So it's just like any sinus in the cardiac system. It's just an area where blood kind of pools. Like in the spleen, we have sinuses. There's just blood pooling there. So same thing here. It's kind of a relay station sitting and waiting. We have subdural space. So that's lying right underneath that dura mater. So subdural space. Subarachnoid space is right inside where the webbing is seen, and that's where you're going to see a lot of your cerebral spinal fluid. That subarachnoid space. What can be bad? If you've ever heard of like a subdural bleed, usually we see those as arterial bleeds, and they go pretty fast. So this is under that dura mater. You can have a subdural bleed. If you had a bleed on top of that, that's not quite as bad, because then it's not right there in that encased brain. One thing you do need to know about the skull itself, you see the fissures that are fused together now because we're adults. We have a closed box. And in that closed box, we have 3 things. 1, you have brain tissue, so that's the brain itself. 2, you have blood, because we have blood vessels bringing blood to that brain tissue. And then the 3rd thing, you have cerebral spinal fluid. So we have a balance with all 3 of those things in this closed box. If either one of those increases, then that means the other 2 are going to have to fall. They're going to have to decrease, because we can't squeeze in any more in that box. It doesn't move. So with brain injuries, if you had someone come and knock this guy in the head with a bat, and you've caused bruising and swelling, bruising's just bleeding, so you increase some blood in this closed box, and then you cause that brain to swell and expand, so we increase brain tissue. That means cerebral spinal fluid has to decrease, and then blood supply, so how much blood we're pumping to this brain will decrease, and that's the most vital thing. Because if you start removing blood from the brain, just like your muscles, you take blood from it, you're taking oxygen from it, it starts to starve and die. The brain will do that as well. So if they have brain injuries, that's when we'll go in and we'll do things like drill a hole and insert a catheter. And this catheter can remove blood, and it can remove cerebral spinal fluid. Or they can even go in and remove sections of the skull itself. So along with this catheter that they put it's a ventral catheter, or ventral catheter. They'll put inside the ventricles itself, and it can drain the cerebral spinal fluid, and it can also test and check what the pressures are inside this brain. It's really cool when you get into neuro things in the neurologic issues. If you do any type of critical care nursing, you'll get to see those V drains and things. So a V drain would go right in a ventricle. So here we have 2 lateral ventricles, that's 1 and 2, and they're right down the middle of the left and right hemispheres, and they kind of circle around. We have a 3rd one right in the middle of the center of the brain, and then going down you have 1 more opening, the 4th one. These 4 ventricles here are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So this stuff circulates all inside the middle of the brain, and it will go down that central canal of the spinal cord and even wrap around the spinal cord and the brain. Remember, bringing nutrients and cleaning up things It's the fluid part. So there's a good illustration of the cerebral spinal fluid. Remember those epidural cells that we have inside the ventricles making cerebral spinal fluid, and then we have other epidural cells that will help sweep and move it. So we start out here in that left and right ventricle of the brain, the first two holes, and it'll travel through down into the third and then fourth ventricle, going straight down and around, and then it circles it. All cerebral spinal fluid. That's the clear, watery looking fluid. So if someone was in a car wreck or had some type of brain injury, and if their nose is running, they'll test it, or if their ears are running, they'll test them. And they do that simply with testing, checking for glucose in it. Because our brain, that's what your brain eats, is glucose. It lives off glucose. So your snot should not have sugar in it, shouldn't have glucose. And then any kind of clear liquid coming from your ears would not be normal. So if you did, then you have some type of fracture somewhere in your skull that you're leaking this fluid. Not a good thing.